Hi, good morning. Hope everybody can hear me. I always get a little nervous when I forget that actually a lot of people come to these things. I always think I'm going to be in a room with like 5 people. So I'm going to try to make contact with all of you, not just 5 people. So I do a lot of looking around. My story is I'm a board certified pediatrician. I started off my career doing well exams, and the best, and I really appreciate Lori Chris for her comments because I think it leads really nicely into the subject. I was a pediatrician who, when asked, did you do drugs? And the child responded, yes. I said, well, don't do drugs. And that's how I left the conversation. Why? Because if the child said, no, I have serious problems, I need help, I would say, what do I do with that? And pediatricians, I can tell you, in all the things that they have to get done in the room, they don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about how you grow up. But no one says, this is what they're going to grow up into. And so, we have to look at it, and I'll talk about this today. This is a developmental issue. This is how kids grow up. I went on from being just a general pediatrician down in Georgia. I did train up in Akron, but I'll admit I am from the South. I'm proud of it. My wife, though, was a Clevelander and made me return. And I'm fine with that. I like the snow. But as you can see, I refuse to dress warmly. I then started working in Akron Children's in their emergency department, where on a Sunday morning in Hudson, if anybody goes to Hudson, we just moved to Boston Heights now, but that's a different story. I had a young man come in saying, I'm in opiate withdrawal, I'm a heroin addict, my brother's in jail and I'm looking for help. And I tried to make phone calls for him. Was told this isn't a life-threatening condition, and we were just ill-prepared. We didn't know how to answer that question, so I had to send him on. I said, maybe you should go to the Cleveland Clinic, maybe they can do better for you. I think since that time, many years ago, Akron, as we've seen the opiate epidemic expand and change in this community, has finally realized that this is a pediatric problem, that we can't just bury our head in the ground and say, when you grow up, you're a heroin addict, or you're an opiate addict. This is a disease that starts in you. So there was a group of us, we all had similar stories, and Akron finally acknowledged that we need to move forward with some type of actual plan other than what we were doing. So I actually went back and did fellowship training at St. Vincent Charity in Addiction, and we actually started our program in February, so I'm happy to be here with you. So today's conversation, we're going to talk about the neurobiology of substance. Whenever I do these slides, I get a little worked up because what I try to do is present a little bit of everything, and unfortunately then you get into like 90 slides and you go, oh my God, wish I could just stick to one subject, but I don't. I want to thank a few different people in the beginning for sharing their slides. Boston Children's is actually like the grandfather of pediatric addiction, so they shared some of their slides with me. I also want to thank Nationwide Children's for sharing some of their slides as well. And then my dear friend Chris Dallas Reyes, who actually, if anybody does the ECHO project, she helps with that here. So basically the plan is to discuss the neurobiology. I always like to start off just briefly with the general definitions of addiction. Think of it as a primary chronic disease of the brain, and the easiest, simplest way I say it is we're dealing with consequence, negative consequence, and how it affects. When we deal with I always like to start off with models. When we used to talk about the old model of addiction, there was this belief that if you had biologic, psychological, social, and a use story, you would flip a switch, and that would lead to substance use addiction. And then so in that, if we could just flip the switch back off, you were cured. And that was great, and that's how we used to run it. But we figured out is there's other things. There's stressors, there's triggers, there's primers, there's exposures, And so that's why we talk about this more as a disease. We just don't cure you. I wish, I tell a lot of my patients with substance use, you're no different than diabetes. You love chocolate, but you can't have a cookie either. You have to look at it. You're going to be fighting, you think you're better, but you're always going to be there. And then when we look at the brain, we know there's just so many parts of the brain that get involved. This is basically when we talk about it, we talk about the nucleus accumbens, the reward center of the brain, and the ventral tegmental areas as it goes out. You can see substances hit all areas. So I always like to go to Nora Volkov's motto, I always say if there was somebody I'd like to have dinner with, Nora Volko would be it, just because she's the granddaughter of Leon Trotsky, if anybody likes their Russian history. And so it's interesting, I do recommend her TED Talks if you've never got a chance to listen to them, because a lot of times she does mention that she had this alcoholic grandfather who did commit suicide. And then she's talking about Leon Trotsky. But basically, this is the general model which we've kind of come to accept, which talks about basically there's a cycle of reward, then you have negative consequence, and it kind of feeds back. You know, for a lot of people, what I always talk about in substances, a lot of people get this concept that I'm trying to get high. And for a lot of people, I say they're not getting high. High is something they once achieved. Now they're just trying to get right. They're just trying to get level so they can live their lives. And so it's this negative cycle. I get sick, I use, I reuse, and they cycle back and forth. And so this is kind of the current model that we're kind of working with now. So then when you deal with adolescents and teenagers, then we're dealing with this model, which I think is pretty much, I always love this one, this is my favorite. Common sense being really small and up in the front, the emotions, I always like the STAR plan. I will admit I have a 12-year-old and an 11-year-old, and the SNARK gland is increasing in size. But, so the first take is adolescents are not adults, you know, it's just that simple. And I think one of the things we have to talk about when we're dealing with adolescents now is you may look like an adult, you may feel like an adult, you may feel empowered like an adult, but your brain is not done developing. That, as we'll talk about today, it doesn't stop when you get your driver's license. It stops way after that point. So they're not adults, and that's, why can't I do it? I go, well, because your brain still is forming. So let's talk about a little bit about the beginning of the development. We have the occipital lobe and the cerebellum. This happens if you remember your own children's development. This allows them, this is your motor coordination in the early days. We move on to the amygdala. Remember your 4-year-old who cried at every emotion. The nucleus accumbens, the reward center of the brain, in young years, which giving an A. The prefrontal cortex, this is really the last part of development. This doesn't really finish forming until about age 25 to 26. This is the part of the brain I really talk about is the regulator for substance. This is the one that says this is a really bad idea. And it really doesn't finish until about age 25. So you can see, the young girl who's texting while she's driving. Not a great idea. So again, this is just a recap where we see each of these developmental phases. So again, when we used to talk about development, people said, well, what age do you hit the adult brain? It must be the weight of the brain, right? The brain is an adult weighted brain, somewhere between age 10 and 12. And what we found out is we were way off on that. It's closer to 25. It was just, if you weighed it, they'd be the same. So really what we were talking about is neuronal development. And so this is what we talk about. When you're born into the world, you have what is an immature brain. This is what it looks like. Usually the synaptic connections, the connections, as you can see, are quite sparse compared to the next picture over. Starting around age, 6 or so, this is where you get what we call blossoming. This is why it's easier for you to learn a language. As my kid said, "Oh, what do you mean you're not studying for your Spanish thing?" "Oh, Dad, I got this." Different conversation. But you can see there's lots of connections. We make all these connections. We're ready to learn. We're primed to do things. And then as we get older, we start refining it. This is what we call synaptic pruning. This is what leads into your adult lifestyle. And then when you're done bringing the brain back to, I guess, what's going to be your adult brain, you begin the process of what's called myelination. Myelination is where you basically, what you learn, you lock in. So all these neurons that are exposed start sealing in, and once they're sealed in, this is who you are. So when I show this is the brain maturation. What you're seeing is a scan, 3D reconstruction MRI, which is basically showing gray matter, which is basically exposed neurons locking into the adult brain, which is called the white matter. And you can see the transition from youth into adulthood, where it's mostly blue. That's all locked in matter. When we look at youth, like I talked about, the last thing that develops is that prefrontal cortex. So really what we call the development of your reward center compared to your prefrontal cortex is adolescence, which makes sense. I always say, if you think about us from a from the animal models, there was a time you had to leave the cave, you had to fight the bear, and you had to make a family, all in a time span of, 30 years if you were lucky. So you had to be willing to take reward, you had to be willing to take risk. But at some point you say that idea of chasing the bear, running after the gazelle is probably not a good idea. At some point it's gonna fight you. So that's what I call the adult years. So this was an interesting study, which I use on my children regularly. Basically, this is looking at triggers, rewards, and if you offer something small, this is looking at children, adults, and teens. If you offered something small, aka if I gave my child a cookie, if you, bring me your shoes, you can see that the little ones respond quite nicely. But if I ask the teenager and the adult to do that in the first response, they don't really do it. They don't really care for it. Now, the next one is the big reward. Okay, I'll let you have the car on a Saturday night, and don't worry about when you can come back as long as you get an A on your math test. Pretty much everybody responded quite highly to that one. So what we know about adolescence is simply adolescents are developmentally primed to seek big rewards. It's true. So let's think about this on a brain level. When we talk about rewards, we're talking about dopamine. So I always like to start off with this one, the natural reward of elevated dopamine levels. We're looking at food and sex. And I always like to keep these in mind. These were dopamine surges. This is basically the pleasure that you receive from the act. And you can see when you deal with food, let's call it 200 for simplicity's sake. When you deal with sex, about the same thing. Now we mix in substances into the mix. And you say, okay, amphetamines hit somewhere in the 1,000. With the new methamphetamines pricing higher than that, cocaine, in the mid 3s and 4s, nicotine, again, above 200, and morphine somewhere in the 200, 300 range. So I always, when I deal with my patients, even the adult ones, I said, you're right, I can't compete with that. So we have to look at what I can compete with, which is you as a person. What are you losing by this game? Is it worth the moment of pleasure? When you deal with adolescents, that's even harder because they go, man, this isn't dangerous. And I go, well, okay, so let's look at it even simpler. Your breath is going to smell bad. You're going to say something stupid. And at the end of the day, you're worse off than when you started. You got, what did you sell to get it? How's that working out? Which is difficult because they don't always see the same level. That's why I always like to show this picture. This was about a year ago. If anybody saw this made the national news, I really love this photo. I actually have two to share because people love to do stuff like this. And I always say this to me is addiction. This is disease. This is the kiss wasn't good enough. You had to take it in this infinity pool. And if you look really closely, those are the tops of trees. They're, I think, 50 feet off the ground. The idea that this is how you had to reward your love. But I always say, how many times can you do this successfully before you drop the woman? How would that have felt? So you could do it once. I love my wife, but I would never do this to her out of sheer respect. And just because people aren't smart enough, they really got to show another same thing. Above the trees, they're riding a train, and when they were asked how stupid this was, their response was, well, the train was moving really slow. I wasn't worried about the speed of the train. I was worried about the act, but okay. But that's how I look at addiction. That's how I look at the disease. It wasn't just enough. The kiss wasn't good enough. Let's make it crazy. So when we look at adolescents are vulnerable. They're vulnerable because early substance use leads to high risk. Their immaturity during critical development periods equals vulnerability. And we know that they have impulsivity and excitement seeking. They can't deal with delayed gratification. And they have poor executive function and inhibitory controls. What we know, this is what is substance, these are kind of the general trends of when we begin to see substance use. Like I said, everybody always said, well, it's an adult problem, right? Well, adults tend to have more money. It doesn't mean kids aren't using, they're just not using maybe to the same degree. They don't, a lot of times people say, well, they're not using that. Well, the problem is they usually move to cheaper substances or what's already in the house. You're right, they don't always have the cash flow to go off on big purchases. So that's typically why you start seeing 16, 17, maybe a little bit of an increase is kind of where they are with access. But what we do know is the younger you start, the more likely you are to lock into a disease. So you can see the younger groups have almost half of them fall into alcohol use, and about 17% for marijuana. I always like to bring up, there's several different studies that we do. There's National Survey on Drug Use and Health. I didn't present any of those slides today because I had to clean this up, but I always like, that looks at everybody, I believe, 12 and up. But I liked, this is the Monitoring the Future. This comes yearly out of Michigan, and they study roughly about 44,000 students, 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. And it kind of gives us a general idea of where we are. So I always like to start off with this because as we begin the substances, as we know, we've really fixated on the opioid crisis. And I believe it does exist in youth, but we have to look at what the real patterns are in youth. And when we really talk about it, we're talking about alcohol, we're talking about marijuana, and now we're dealing with the e-cigarette craze. So again, this is just, and the big push right now, and this is what you've been hearing all over the news, is most of our substances at least have gone down a little bit compared to where we were last year, but the e-cigarette craze is more than doubled. So that's kind of the concern. And when people talk about, people always say, well, the gateways theory isn't true. The problem is people look at gateway as I do A, so I had to go to B. The problem is you got to look at it more like a doorway. You open the door to the idea that you can move through the doorway. Some people are going to cross that threshold. Some are not going to cross the threshold. And if you can tell me who those kids are, let me know, because that's the mistake we made with every other substance, right? They're from a good neighborhood. So that can't be a problem in a good neighborhood. I gotta be honest, my kids' school, the parents had to have a sit down with their kids and about e-cigarettes, and with the school called all the 8th graders in. And they said, well, that's not really a problem, to which they then started pulling out gallon bags of e-cigarettes and said, we've collected this from your kids on school property. How we look at the world. Like I said, don't do drugs. It's simple. It's a beautiful time. If anybody's interested, I highly recommend watching the old Dare ads. I really like Clint Eastwood when we tried to do this with cocaine. I've never seen it. It's great. Pee Wee Herman did one too. You know, they were great. They're really good if you need something to do on a Saturday night. I like it. I'm a big saluter of history. So the big thing is, cannabis, we have seen a little bit of a drop compared to the 8th grade, and my hope is that that's a continued truth. Again, this mostly just shows some of the general trends. I know it's hard to see, it's hard for me to see up here to remember. Mostly it's just talking about the cigarettes have gone down, but the e-cigarettes have more than doubled across the groups. And then again, we've seen binge drinking go down a little bit this last year compared to this past. So let's talk about the 3 bigs. Alcohol, marijuana, and e-cigarettes. So we'll talk about alcohol first. Kind of what part of the brain does it affect, and what part of the brain doesn't it affect? It pretty much goes everywhere it wants to. It doesn't really decide. I always like to start off with this first. So behavioral effects, when we looked at adolescents compared to adult rats, and they decided to give them all a drink, don't ask me what they offered them. What we found is the adult ones tended to want to go to sleep, and the adolescents pretty much just wanted to party. Basically what it's saying is the motor functioning of the adult compared to the adolescent. If they wanted to sleep, the motor function really didn't get impaired to the degree in adolescent. Which then led to another example of this. This was called the water maze test, which I love. If anybody can figure out what scientist came up with this great idea. They basically got them both drunk, threw the adult and the adolescent rat into a thing of water, and there's somewhere buried in this water is a platform. Okay. And the goal is to get out of the pool. And what they found is the adolescent compared to the adult swam a lot harder, but it took them both the same amount of time to find their way out of the pool. So what they found is the motor functioning doesn't get impaired. So therefore the risk doesn't seem the same. So again, speed changes, but it still took just as much time. So what we know is that they just don't see the same impairment that adults do, even though the risk is still the same at the end of the day. And what we know is when you looked at in 2013, the top 4 leading causes of death involved alcohol. The other part I like to talk about is they did do a study with MRIs and looking at the hippocampus in adolescents, and I'll move on to this slide, and they took a group that qualified alcohol use disorder versus healthy, and the healthy didn't have they actually did correct? I believe for mental health, because everybody loves to say, well, it was a mental health issue more than a substance problem, because we like to separate these two things. But you can actually see those who qualified as heavy alcohol use had small hippocampus. Hippocampus controls memory in the brain. So we'll move on to marijuana. So I'll briefly talk about the psychoactive substance in marijuana people talk about is THC. I'll try to say delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. It's a primary psychoactive substance. It accumulates in adipose tissue. Can last up to several days to a week. Elimination of the half-life. I've seen actually people who were heavy users who then decide to go on weight loss, and it'll pop up in their urines later because it builds up as they're sweating off their fat. And it acts on endogenous cannabinoid receptors present in the central and peripheral nervous system. These are the areas of the brain. It affects motor, memory. Again, the reward center, the hippocampus. So I always like to start off with this one. In 1988, we finally found, everybody always said, well, marijuana works. So we finally figured it out. We found the cannabinoid receptors in 1988. By 1992, we finally figured out how it worked. We actually found the substance in the brain. So this is how I talk to kids. I go, don't you want to know how it works? I said, there is. You make something just like marijuana in your brain. It's called anandamide. If anybody's really into history, it's bliss. It means bliss in Sanskrit. But we finally found the actual substance. We make some of it. It was hard to find because we barely make anything. It basically blips on the radar and disappears. And this is what the two molecules look like when you compare them to each other. You can see structurally they look very similar. And so what does anandamide do? What does the endocannabinoid system do in the brain? What we figured out is it basically acts like a volume control. So I always use the example of your dad. Don't touch the air conditioning. Don't touch the radio, right? You touch the radio, what are you going to do? When you touch the heating system, well, you turn down the air conditioning, I'm going to turn it right back up, and I'm going to turn it up louder. And that's how it does. It's a regulator of the system. So when you use, it turns it down. But at the same time, what's the system going to do? It's going to reset to a higher point. And so that's kind of how I look at it. So I embrace my patients. I tell them, I understand how it helps your anxiety. But that's short-lived. That's not how your body's going to say, ain't going to work for me long-term. I need more anxiety. Whether they want to listen to me is a different conversation. And so the other part that we have to understand about the endocannabinoid system is it helps guide neurons to grow in the right place of the brain. So we see function impairment. And it's basically shaping the way the brain wiring and that pruning that we talked about, and then ultimately that myelination, that locking into who your adult brain is. So basically the simplest analogy my friends use is that THC is a much stronger and longer lasting effect than anandamide. So it's kind of like the scalpel versus the sledgehammer. And that's how we have to think about it. It's working much broader. And it interferes with the cell function and growth like we talked about. So this was a study, I forget what year this was, but this basically compared what the THC potency on the receptor comparatively. And what we found is anandamide is about half the strength of THC. I believe this was from the year 2000. So we see anandamide is half the strength of THC. Now the fun part about this is, moving on to my next slide. So this is my favorite study. This was done between 1995 and 2014, and the DEA would make bus, and then we would test it for the concentration of THC. And what they found is, before 1995, THC concentrations in marijuana was less than 4%. By 2014, we were up to 12% concentrations now. We could talk about legalization versus decriminalization, but ultimately what's going on now is, I think what we've seen with the legalization brings industry. And when you bring industry to market, their job is to sell product. And when you want to sell product and nobody gives any guidelines that says this is how it should be, now we have strains that are being selectively bred for 30 to 40% THC concentrations. If you're doing dabs and resins, 90 to 100% concentration. So I always like to go back one slide and say this was a study done in 2000 when we were seeing less than 4% THC, roughly. And now, so you can almost imagine what these numbers must look like now to the adolescent brain. And again, we go back to the original conversation about reward. Well, I could give you something that has no alcohol content, or don't you want to get drunk tonight? An adolescent will say, I want to get drunk. So what we're seeing is adolescents do tend to go And they like novelty, so they do like to go to concentrates. They do like to go to resins. They like to go to damps. So they want the good stuff. They want the strong stuff. So, and what we see long-term effects. So what are we seeing based on knowing that on a general model, knowing that it controls regulation? Well, we've seen increased psychosis, we've seen increased depression, we've seen increased anxiety, diminished satisfaction in life, cognitive decline, and ultimately addiction. Same thing, the hippocampus, the memory part of the brain. We've seen that get affected, we've seen that in reduced neuronal activation. And we see gradual loss due to the continual suppression. So we know they have poorer memory. The next thing, and we've had several studies that have now done this. I always love this first one I like to talk about is basically we've seen neuropsychological decline from childhood to midlife. And really this was done out of a New Zealand study. If anybody's ever heard of the Dunedin study, it was started off 30-something years ago, basically just look at development in this small town in New Zealand where they had a hospital. And they just were looking for developmental milestones. And somehow, God bless the gentleman that started it, kept getting funding. So now they've been doing this for almost 40 years now, I think. And they're actually moving on to the children of the original participants. So what we know, when we looked at these, and of 1,000, and like I said, they've gone all the way up to age 38, and this is actually an older slide, they're now in their 40s, this is what we're looking is IQ. And what we found is people that never used, these are their general IQ, somewhere between 99.8 to 100. Those who were marijuana dependent for about 3 years at least, they had roughly about a 10-point loss in IQ compared to the other group. What we also know is, in the same breath, they also found mental health, psychosis, schizophrenia, anxiety, depression 2 to 5 times of developing. The reason why they said, why is there not one number, is because a lot of argument against these kind of studies where people said, well, you had people that already were predisposed to mental health. They had schizophrenia in their family, for example. So they decided to break it into a range. They said, okay, if you have no history, you have a 2 times risk, odds ratio. If you have a family history, you're 5 times. Now can you live with that information? And that's how they have to look at it. So good, you have no family history, we still give you 2 times odd ratio. This is the similar cohort. So people said, oh, that's a one-off. Well, this isn't the only time we've done this study. There's also a great study out of Sweden, which looked at basically the same thing, and I believe they found somewhere close to basically the same thing 2 times or so to, again, if you have some history, 7.4% odd. They call this a hazard ratio, but it's basically an odds ratio. So if you have family history, it's more likely. And I would say this was a fascinating study for those who love history and love government error. This was basically what they originally did with these patient cohort, was everybody has military conscription in Sweden. And so roughly about 30-something years ago, they had to fill out personal information about themselves. And one of the things they did were substance screening, and marijuana is legal there. And all this information, you didn't have to fill out the substance histories. Those were completely optional. It did not stop you from going to military service. So these were all voluntary screeners. And then basically, after they did their military time, all these things were supposed to be destroyed. And somebody found a box sitting in a basement of roughly about 40,000 of these forms. And then because of their health systems, they were able to look and say, okay, now I got the name of the patient. Have they ever used our health systems for mental health and things? And so they found all these people, 30-something years later, those who had mental health diagnoses and had been treated. So I like accidental studies, Says we didn't force anybody to do it. All right, so moving on to e-cigarettes. I kind of do a little bit of just, for those who don't know much about it, I'm still learning about it. I'm old-fashioned. I just remember light one end and smoke the other. And I do like this, and I think it's interesting. Again, I'm a history person. For those who don't know the history of cigarettes in this country, in the early 1900s is when we automated making cigarettes. Before that, people hand-rolled cigarettes. So if you smoked maybe 4 or 5 cigarettes a day, that was what you did, right? You had to roll it. If you ever tried to roll a cigarette, that ain't easy. When we automated it and now we created packs of cigarettes, that's when smoking became popular in this country. And then we've seen it increase ever since then. So it's no surprise when we get to the e-cigarette, I'll show you, the easier you make it, act surprised when everybody does it and does it in bulk. But basically when we talk about basically there's a cartridge or a reservoir. That's where you hold the liquid. You have a heating element, which is the atomizer. You have a power source. And then you have the mouthpiece ultimately. And that's why they call it vaping. So you basically inhale the vapor created by the heat. These are the different generations. There was the first generation, they weren't very good. They had battery issues. A lot of people didn't get into them. And you can kind of see when by the time we got to 4th generation, they're pretty high tech. Which really I like talking about this slide, because I didn't even understand this to some greater degree until somebody shared. But there's really 2 forms, they call them mods. There's vape mods and pod mods. Vape mods, refillable tank, customizable coil. This is kind of for the enthusiasts, usually tend to do this, people who like to tinker with the way they use it. When we talk about juuling, we're really talking about pod mod. It's just a closed system, stored in a disposable pod. Popular people want to smoke easy. And basically they can do some adjustments there. This is what, when we talk about juuling, we talk about the pod mod. Again, this is what we see with the jewels, real nicely, sexy. Even in my understanding is you can adjust the smoke coming out of them. So like I learned from my son, kids will do it in classroom and blow into their sleeve and you won't even notice that they're smoking. They think it's cool. So what exactly is a joule? When you look at it, we're talking about 1 to 2 packs a day, about 20 to 40 cigarettes in one pod. I will share, I had to do some paperwork at one of my recovery centers, and the woman who was making me fill out the paperwork the entire time I was in there, and I thought it was kind of a strange behavior, kept sucking on her. She had a mod. She was doing it the whole time. I thought it was impressive, like where it used to be the standard norm, you knew not to smoke when you're in the middle of a meeting. She couldn't even stop herself for 5 minutes just to get me to sign some paperwork. She kept going right on through. Did I notice any real smoke? Not really, but I was like, can't stop. Just let me fill out my paperwork. And again, what we see under the radar, compared to 27, we've seen the smoking change, just how the general use. So higher percentage of schoolers in the past month. So as Lori Chris kind of talked about, we used to talk about what was called free-base nicotine versus nicotinic salts. Free-base nicotine was that treated with the free-base was basically, I believe, treated with ammonia. Actually, I'll go to my next slide. The nicotinic salt is kind of like your nicotine on steroids. And what I mean by that is, when we talk about joules, I'm going to talk about joules specifically in Crack's lab, but Philip Morris was the ones who originally came up with this idea of adding ammonia to create the free-base nicotine, which basically concentrated the nicotine. Juul decided to add benzoic acid to it, which created the nicotine salt. So basically what happens with nicotine salt is you decrease the alkalinity and it increases the nicotine level, and it also decreases the point for which it burns, so you can make lower heat and have the same effect. So basically you can make smaller products easier to conceal. And the other thing is it crosses the blood-brain barrier easier, and it's supposed to give like a nicer hit, so to speak. But the idea is when you do, you get more nicotine. Not only do you get high concentration nicotine, it's able to cross the blood-brain barrier easier. So to give you an idea of what that actually looks like, if you look at the very bottom, the lower slide was just the plain original e-vapor cigarette would require a higher burning point compared to what we're doing now with when we talk about joules compared to actually lighting a cigarette. You can see they're almost identical now. The other thing I like to talk about, there's a concept called dripping and there's a concept called dabbing. Drip it just because adolescents love to do things. They basically modify their e-cigarettes by dripping nicotine directly on the coil and breathe it in that way. We call it a nicotine hit. 25% of adolescents said they've engaged in dripping, recent surveys. And that's where we talk about designing it for kids, and they said they didn't, but manufacturers definitely made the coils easier to access to do such things. We talk about dabbing. This is the other thing. This is a dabbing apparatus, if anybody's ever seen one before. Basically, this is where we talk about the resin, the dabbing. There's a little glass nail, and you take a little bit, and basically you'll have to use a blowtorch, a little blowtorch device, and you basically just heat the wax and breathe it in. That's what people talk about when they're dabbing THC, not including dab pens. So what do we know about e-cigarettes in the developing brain? One study showed that e-cigarettes, if they start by 9th grade, were more likely than others to start smoking cigarettes other than smokable tobacco products within the next year. It kind of makes sense for those who know about e-cigarettes. I think they're like 40 or 50 bucks. Kids, again, we have limited resources, so it's cheaper to get cigarettes. So they may start thinking this is cool, but once they're addicted, they'll go the other direction because of cost. Same thing, smoking progression to actual cigarettes. Remember that when e-cigarettes first came out, I always say, remember the real name for them is electronic nicotine delivery systems, or ENDS. It was supposed to be the end all. And what happened is kids are using it, for people who are recovering, the data's kind of all over the place for adults. But for kids, this is the entry point, not the ending point. So again, about 7 times more likely they'd smoke cigarettes when asked approximately 6 months later. Again, I think that has to do, they've become addicted and they're out of funds. It's just easier. Again, this is just kind of reiterating these kind of points, the odds ratios. Yeah, what time was break? Now, perfect, all right. I'll move ahead. These are both the same thing. The only thing I don't. Oh, we're good. Wow. I get nervous because I told you I have a lot of slides. But basically, we talk about it again: breathing in, going into the lungs, going through the blood-brain barrier. But we know it increases blood pressure, breathing, and heart rate. Show a little closer. It interacts with the reward centers. The adolescent e-cigarettes are higher risk of progress to marijuana use. There is data to support that. I believe it's about 2.5 to 4 times more likely to use marijuana. Again, a lot of times what we see in adolescents is they haven't really committed to one substance. That's why, like I said, the gateway theory, people say, well, you're just going to move on. No, it just opens the door. So a lot of kids same thing, just like when we talk about marijuana use, they don't tend to use it in isolation. They do marijuana plus alcohol. They don't usually stick to one substance. They're looking for the dopamine surge. But we see that is higher if you start with 6. Again, same thing. Long term, we know, people keep saying, well, this isn't the same kind of nicotine, so you're not getting the tar. There are concerns about the heating coils themselves. You're breathing in heavy metals as well. And we're still dealing with, they use, vitamin E, benzoic acid, so there is concerns about that too. The other thing is, we also know, because again, you're using these, you're activating the reward center, these kids are more likely to move into other substances such as cocaine, methamphetamines for more pleasure. And again, it also affects just the general concentration and circuitry of the brain.
Can you speak a little bit louder?
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. What I was saying was, we know that it affects the development of the circuitry of the brain, so therefore they're just more unlikely to move on. So my final slide is what's been going on, and I actually, in the urgent care, actually it was last week, I had a young man come in for some skin condition, but my nurse comes out and says he's wheezing. And I said, well, I'll listen to his lungs. Sure enough, he was wheezing. And I said, did you know you're wheezing? Do you have a history of asthma? He goes, no, man, I just get this from marijuana. It's not, and the mom's looking like, and I'm going, well, that's not a problem, man. It's just when I use weed. I go, but you're wheezing. It's not normal. That's not. And then he even decided to sprout off, well, it's just because people are using, but the stuff I'm using is okay. He's basically saying, what their concern is, what we found is about 77% of the vaping-related illness was linked to THC products. Specifically, what they're concerned about is these were not production modifications. These were from, let's say, third-party or illegal sellers. that they modified the product. So I always say we have to be very careful about how we discuss e-cigarettes in general, because if we make the connection, it's your product, and we're wrong about how we say it, then they get to throw their hands up and say, you guys came after us indiscriminately. But I think the issue that we have to address is, you sure did make it easy for kids to get it. You sure did make it easy for people to modify it, and you sure did turn a blind eye to what would happen when those things came down the pipe. So when you did, we talked, Laura Chris talked about making mango flavor, champagne, making the product easy to modify, making it colorful, putting smiley faces on it. These are all things that, who are you aiming for? The sophisticated smoker? And again, what we've seen, there's been 805 confirmed cases of vaping-related illness in 46 states in the Virgin Islands, and I believe we've had 24 or 12 deaths. This was as of today. So, I just want if Miss Brown could stand up for a second. I'm going to put somebody on spot. So this is Miss Talia Brown, because she'll be here all day, but she's my program coordinator at Akron Children's. People are saying, so what are you doing related to the ongoing epidemics? We currently are an inpatient hospital service. We are working to, hopefully in the next year, have an outpatient service line at the Children's Hospital. We're hoping for early 2020. But this is our phone number if we need to be reached. Right now, we're trying to link with our community partners to try to send patients, or if there's something that can be done in-house, we'll be happy to help, and we're happy to answer any questions.